Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode in A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. This is Kai McAllister. Hello, hello. And today I am joined by a very esteemed panel, a panel of three, which is very appropriate given that this episode is our 300th episode. So we're dealing in threes today. We have a three-person panel on the 300th episode. And the title of today's episode, or the topic of today's episode, is also germane to the number 300 for reasons which I will get into, or which others will get into very shortly. I think those who are cinematically literate already know where this is going. But before we do that, let me introduce today's panel. In no particular order, we are joined today by the esteemed Sir Chris Coppola.
Hi, good people.
And His Excellency, Lord Evan Buck.
That's Pope Evan Buck to you. But anyway,
Yes.
I'll take that title as well. Why not? Hey, everyone. How's it going? It's your boy, Evan.
So, what is today's topic? Well, as I said, it is the 300th episode, and therefore we are legally obliged to discuss the most important instance of the number 300 in history, and that is the Battle of Thermopylae, where allegedly 300 Spartans faced off against allegedly 2 million Persians. We gotta fact check Herodotus here for a second. I'll let Evan Buck and Chris Coppola do some more delving into that, but that is our topic for today. My friends, take it away with the explanation.
Yeah. So, and actually, one last thing that in terms of just cleanup duty, before we get into the main body of the podcast is, I think, given that it's the 300th episode and all of the active members of the A Fork in Time panel are here, astute listeners might note the fact that there is one person who is missing from our happy bunch, and that is Dylan Holzmer. We wanted to give a proper send-off, a proper goodbye to him. He is having to, at this point, handle some personal matters. We earnestly hope that he'll be able to return to the show panel on a consistent basis at some point in the future. But as of now, it is going to be the three musketeers of us manning the crew at this point. So with that in mind and that quick little send-off, and I'll give you guys also both opportunities to say your goodbyes to Dylan later on in the show. But we will now dive right into the fork and the what did of the Battle of Thermopylae. So as Kai excellently elucidated upon, the legend of Herodotus, who, let's understand kind of the importance of this person. In a lot of senses, he is one of, if not the only primary source or secondary source for a lot of this information. And you kind of have to take a lot of what he says with a grain of salt at certain points because, like Kai noted, 2 million Persians is basically flat out inconceivable, almost impossible in terms of numbers for an army at this stage in antiquity. Not going to happen. Historians estimate that the actual size of the army was probably in the high tens of thousands, if not 100,000, maybe 200,000 at most. But the point is they still hugely and vastly outnumbered the coalition Greek army that was holding this mountain pass, the Pass of Thermopylae, with the impending Persian invasion. But let's take a step back a little bit and kind of understand what's going on between the Greeks and the Persians at this point. The Persians at this point hold most of what is known as, well, really, the Middle East, Afghanistan, Pakistan, modern day Iran, Iraq, the Levant, Palestine, Israel, all of those areas. They have marched across to into modern day Turkey, which is known as Asia Minor back at this point. And they have their sights set upon conquering the Greeks. Now, the Greeks at this point are not the Greece that we know today. They are primarily a bunch of small, warring, semi-friendly, frenemies, whatever you want to call them, city-states. Some of them are more hostile to each other than others. Some of them kind of play each other as pawns. But the point is that Greece is split. The two main ones that we often think of in this point of time in history are the Spartans and the Athenians. And these two different civilizations had vastly different ideas about military tactics and what were the important values to them. The Spartans, you can basically kind of classify as might makes right, very masculine, very strong. The Athenians are much more of the brain side of the brawn versus brains equation, and they're primarily focused on being skilled tacticians and philosophers and all of those sorts of things. And so with the Persian threat looming upon them, there was even early on, and the time frame we're talking about is around 500 BC or so, 500 to the late 490s BC. The Battle of Thermopylae, if I remember correctly, happens, I think, like at 499 BC, if I remember the date specifically correctly. So be that as it may,
It's 480 BC.
480 BC. Thank you for that correction.
Yeah.
Both in terms of, I do think we should mention a little bit of where is Greece? Because
Yes.
today we're about to get the podcast banned in Turkey. I'm okay with that. The kind of, if you picture the Aegean Sea, the entire shell of the land around it was Greek. In other words, there were Greeks in what is today Western Turkey. The coastline there is the historical home of Troy, and is actually very important to triggering all of this. It's because that area, then called Ionia, was initially taken over by the Persian Empire, but there were revolts against the Persian Empire supported by Athens, which basically got the Persians to
That's what touched off this series of events that we're talking about during this show. Yes, I think that's very helpful context to keep in mind. Another way I'm going to get the show banned, I'll get it banned in Greece too. You know what? Let's go for like as many countries as we can get this podcast banned in one fell swoop. But I remember joking with Chris, ironically not in this pre-podcast, but a different pre-podcast discussion. I'm like, you know how to trigger a Greek person? Just call them West Turkey. You know how to trigger a Turkish person? Call them Eastern Greece.
I am going to say this, however, though, critical support to Armenia. Joe Kasabian over on Lines Led by Donkeys. We love him. We're not touching Armenia, okay? They are like the third trifecta in this. We don't want that smoke.
No, we're gonna leave those alone. And I just listened to an episode of Lions Led by Donkeys where they talked about the Crusades. And at the very end of that episode, this episode 421, they're like, you know what? We don't like talking about alternate history, but let's talk about alternate history. And I'm just like, yes, our little shred of what we do has been recognized by our favorite podcast. So there you go. One of our favorite podcasts anyway. But with that helpful context in mind, Thermopylae is geographically, it's a very important point for the Persian invasion because it's kind of a choke point. It's a very mountainous region, a mountainous area, and the Spartans and the coalition Greeks, they know their way around this area a lot better than the Persians do. Now, I noted that the Persians have Afghanistan, Pakistan, a lot of the Middle East under their control at this point. That is important to know. And even modern day Iran is a very mountainous country. So, they know mountain warfare, they know the terrain generally, but they don't know what the Greeks know. So the coalition army of about 6,000 are able to hold pretty well at this pass of Thermopylae, this choke point, and it gets so narrow at certain points that you can really only have like one cart and like one man. It's like basically one man wide. It's incredibly hard to get through. And given the tactical advantage that the Greeks had, they're able to just, drive them back, hold the line to a much bigger degree than their small numbers would suggest. The Persians are basically trying to ram their way through, and every time they do that, they're just going to be met with very fierce resistance. So even though they have a high numerical advantage, they are not going to get through anytime soon. Now, as the legend goes, according to the ever reliable Herodotus, they were betrayed, they being the Greeks. They were betrayed by, what was his name? I had it on my document. I'm not remembering at this point, but his name doesn't really matter because he's probably not a real person to begin with. So we'll just say, for purpose of argument, we don't remember who this guy is.
I think it's Ephialtes of Trachis.
There he is. Yes, I have him. It's right near the top of my doc. I don't know. I must be blind. I didn't see it. But yeah, Ephialtes of Trachis. I probably butchered that pronunciation. He was supposedly the guy who betrayed the coalition army, and they showed the Persians a route around the choke point. Now, historically, what more likely than not actually happened is the Persians probably just ended up stumbling across or finding this pathway around themselves, but the Greeks needed to create a mythos, some sort of grand narrative that would basically make them not look so bad for losing this battle. But we'll just take Herodotus's word for it and say that they got betrayed. So at this point, once the Greeks realized that the gig was up and the Persians are going to be able to circumvent them and take the position, King Leonidas of the Spartans famously sends the rest of the coalition forces packing, and he says, look, guys, you guys need to flee. You guys need to regroup. I am the king of the proud Spartan 300-strong contingent. And we are going to, and I remember, again, our old pal Herodotus basically recounted Leonidas saying this whole speech about how, we're going to keep fighting them with our swords. And if we don't have swords, we're going to fight them with our sticks and stones and everything. And if we don't have those, then we're going to fight them just biting them with our teeth until all of us have fallen. Essentially, this very inspiring, totally not written by Orlando Bloom narrative of we're going to fight to the very last man to the death, to kill as many Persians as we can, to stall them out as hard as we can. And that is what they did. Whether you consult Herodotus or what the historians say, for all intents and purposes, the rest of the coalition forces withdraw. The Spartans do what they can, fight as hard as they can, but they know that it's going to be a losing battle. There's no way 300 men are going to be able to hold out against, let's say, 100 grand Persians. But they'll do the best they can. So in our timeline, the Persians, of course, win this battle. They end up progressing in their campaign and going down. And Chris, I'll actually let you take over from here because I've been soliloquizing for a while. You can summarize this next part better than I can. But essentially, this leads to a new phase of the war in Greece. The Persians take the fight directly all the way to Athens. And Chris, what happens in Athens?
They burn it.
Does it stay in Athens? What happens in Athens stay in Athens? I don't know.
It kind of does, because Athens was kind of the one that poked the Achaemenid Persians in the eye. They're the ones that were supporting the revolt in Ionia over in what is today Western Turkey. They were kind of the target of this. So basically, like the Thebans, the Spartans, everybody else in Greece got involved only when the Persians came into Greece. So the Persians come through Thermopylae, come down and burn Athens because that was their cause of belly. That's what they were going after. Once they do that, Salamis, the Greeks basically, and especially the Athenians, basically use naval tactics because whatever else you want to say about the Persian Empire being Afghan, Persian, Pakistani, they're not a naval power. And there's a lot of interesting work on the effects of naval power on like what that does to the nation that has it. But basically, the Athenians and other Greek navies defeat the Persian supply fleet. The Persians don't really have a like navy in the sense of a fighting ships. They don't have a lot of those. Athenian navy defeats them and basically makes it so that the Persians can't feed even 100,000 people, let alone the 2-3 million that Herodotus would lead us to believe they're supplying. That leads to basically weakening of the Persians. The other way it's also painted is the sacrifice of the 300 Spartans gives the rest of Greece, i.e., Thebes and everyone else, time to get their armies together. They eventually do defeat the Persians at Plataea, I believe. And that defeat, plus the fact that they can't feed themselves anymore, leads to the Persians militarily withdrawing. But I think we're going to get into the effects of the Persians don't go away. I mean, they might go to the other side of the Bosporus, but they're still going to be involved in what happens in Greece in terms of keeping their hands in that. And kind of want to throw to Ty because he started talking about what's the next thing that happens and what's really important in terms of once the Persians are out, what's the next thing?
Yeah. Well, I'd really quick just step in before Kai delves into that, just to make it very clear for our audience what the fork is that we're going to be taking for this episode. Again, we're going to take what Herodotus says. They got betrayed, and we're going to say, no, the Spartans and the coalition army did not get betrayed. They're able to, whether it's seen as a victory or just seen as a stalemate, for a purpose of the fork in time, we're going to say the Persians get stalled out, repelled, whatever you want to call it, at Thermopylae, instead of it being a complete victory like it was in our timeline. With that being said, Kai, take it from here.
Yeah, well, first of all, to address that, I think we have to be realistic here. We can't just fall for Herodotus's propaganda that, if not for the backstab, the Spartans would have held out against the Persians. It seems unlikely, right? Even if we just take the numbers that Herodotus gives us, and we say that those numbers are not, we just look at those numbers, right? He says it's about 2 million Persians versus 300 Spartans. That's logistically a tall order, right? But let's say it's 300 Spartans and 200,000 Persians instead. That's more conceivable. It's still outlandish to suspect that the Spartans could actually win. But what we can hope for is that they are slowed to the point where they have to make tactical retreats, and it gives the Athenians time to put together a coalition such that the key event never takes place, which is that Athens is never ransacked. And that gets to what Chris just mentioned, which is that after all of this takes place in our timeline, the thing that comes after is what's known as the Peloponnesian War, right? Essentially, the Greeks, mainly the Athenians, are able to repel the Persians due to superior tactics, superior naval armaments, etc., pushing the Persians back. And then the Greeks, which had formed this thing called the Delian League, the Delian League transforms from a more defensive force that is used to repel Persian invaders and becomes something more akin to the British Royal Navy, which is a colonial force, an expansionist force. And this, of course, displeases Sparta greatly. They are not happy with it. And that leads to a war between the two, which ultimately leads to Athens succeeding once again, defeating Sparta, leading to an incorporated Greece, which is the Greece that we know and love, that the Romans also knew and love, the Greece that you think of when you think of Greece.
What is the name for the wars between Athens and Sparta?
The Peloponnesian War. Did I not say that? Oh, if I didn't say it, I never said the Peloponnesian War. Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
No,
I could have sworn I
I'm pretty
said
sure
it.
I'm pretty sure you said it, but
Okay.
our audience
Okay.
members will be able
Yeah.
to call to fact check
Yeah.
us on that.
If I didn't say it, then yes, let me state clearly that was the Peloponnesian War, and it resulted in an Athenian victory, and it was of great consequence. So now, when we go back to the fork, we can say, what would the consequences be if Sparta? I hesitate to call it as successful because I think that's too grandiose a term. But what if Sparta is more is better able to stave off a Persian invasion, slow it down to a snail's pace, such that they're never able to mount a successful invasion of Athens? How does that affect the Peloponnesian War? How does that affect Sparta in particular? Any thoughts?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm just going to say, remember that it was only once the position was deemed hopeless that King Leonidas made it the 300 that we know, and what we get from the legendary line in the movie, "This is Sparta." Yeah, that only happens when the coalition forces are kicked out.
Well, when he says we're gonna slow everyone else down, they don't really kick them out. They say go back.
Well, yeah, that's kind of what I meant. I was kind of oversimplifying it, but yeah, they sent the other coalition forces back. At this point in this alternate timeline, we're assuming that the Greek front of 6,000 are the ones who are staying in the Pass of Thermopylae. This might not seem important at first glance, but Chris, you made an excellent point in the pre-podcast, which is Spartans don't like it when other people take military cred from them. They are the militaristic, macho, war-loving people. And if you have what I basically said in my pre-podcast discussion, a bunch of Athenian twink femboys basically claiming a decent bit of the credit for what the Spartans see as their military victory or stalemate, whatever you want to call it, repelling of the Persian invasion, that's not going to make them very happy, I would say. Chris, it seems like you're eager to jump in on that.
One, I do think it's important to think about this isn't yet binary. This isn't yet Athens versus Sparta. Thebes, and there are a lot of other Greek city-states involved in this. And this kind of what happens in this invasion between the Spartans kind of taking the land route to slow down the Persians, the Athenians taking the sea route at Salamis. That is what kind of leads to this bifurcation of our understanding of Greece. It's okay, we're right in the middle of our American Revolution series. This will probably be coming out after it, but I think a good way to explain it is actually, I kind of like this. Sparta's Virginia, Athens is Massachusetts. There's 11 other colonies. There's other people involved here.
I thought you were going to make a comparison to different branches of the U.S. military, and I'm like, oh man, we are really triangling to tick off everyone with this episode.
But like, hey,
I like
And
the
so, like,
implication that Virginia and Massachusetts matter and the others are just ancillary city-states of little
yes,
importance.
because look at where everybody, like Ben Franklin, everybody is from one or the other two. But
New York has entered the
Yeah,
chat.
I was just about to say New York has entered the chat. Yeah.
I get what you're saying, though, Chris. I get what you're saying.
I would normally stand up and say, historically, name a founding father from New York.
I don't know. I can't think of one off the top of my head.
Part of me, because I have control of a post production, wants to lengthen that dead air.
Yeah.
But there wasn't.
Exactly.
But I think it's important here that if it is still the unified army at Thermopylae, you don't see this rise of the two different. So maybe you don't see. Basically, the reason I kind of wanted to make sure we use the word Peloponnesian War is because of Thucydides. Basically, he wrote the Peloponnesian War, and ever since, his argument was Athens, because of the Delian League, was the established power. Sparta was the other that wanted to rise, wanted to come on the scene and become important. And the argument is there is no way that they were not going to go to war with each other. Since then, that has come into play with people making the argument that there was no way that Imperial Germany could become a thing without coming into conflict with Great Britain. And today, it's an important kind of conception to argue that China can't become a world power again without coming into military conflict with the United States.
When you mentioned Germany, I thought you were going to make some sort of parallel between German unification and Greek unification, but I don't know. Anyway,
I just point out that I think it's arguable that Alexander Hamilton was from New York.
From the Caribbean.
Yeah, I was going to say.
I mean, we're going off of where he was born from, yeah, but where he died, I mean, where he lived, but yeah.
Yeah, very good point. But anyway, we have enough things we're name dropping in this episode.
Not. Pretty sure he died in Jersey. The duel was on the other side of the river.
Just to be even more pedantic. But anyway, Chris always has to have the final word, and he does because he is in control of post-production. So
also, like, bad things happen in Jersey.
True. True. But anyway, I think you present a very good point, and that is that, you know, a lot of how we view Greek history after this point has to do with this whole, difference between the two major city-states, the Athenians and the Spartans. That was definitely far from a guaranteed thing, especially at this point. But what I also think is something to mention as well is that in our timeline, we saw this being a unifying factor for the Greeks. And, again, kind of how the mythos goes and how a lot of people oversimplify this is it's like, okay, the Spartans, amazing, selfless sacrifice just immediately led to all the Greeks putting all their differences aside, uniting to drive out the Persians. Everybody's happy. The end. Not really. It wasn't quite so simple. If you examine what happened in the immediate short-term aftermath of this battle, it actually led to a rather significant disagreement between the brain versus the bronze side of the Greek camps. The Athenians basically argued, look, clearly the land-based brawn approach failed and was done in. We got to take a different tact. We got to take things to task to the Persians in the sea. The Spartans were, as you can imagine, predictably stubborn and said, no, we can do what we can, and we can do what we can do best, and that is we can hold them off with brute force and brute strength on the land. Well, ultimately, the Athenian point of view proved to be much more efficacious, and I would argue that one of the greatest outcomes of this battle going against the Greeks in the short term and being arguably bad for the Greeks in the short term is that it really helped the coalition forces not only set aside their differences and unify, but it really helped the Greeks learn the tactics and develop the tactics that they needed to learn and develop in order to eventually drive out the Persians. Roll all of that back, you don't have any of that happen in the alternate timeline. I think that there is less unity because, Kai, you mentioned at the start and in the pre-production that a Greek victory or stalling at the Battle of Thermopylae would probably really energize the Greeks. I think it would really animate and accentuate the conflict between the Greeks and between the city-states, because now the Spartans have something that they can point to and say, hey, look, Athenians, we were able to get the job done with our approach. Why should we waste time on the sea? Like, we barely know how to swim. We're landlubbers. We're good. And Chris, as you noted in the pre-podcast as well, the Spartans end up having their own navy financed by none other than the Persians to foment civil strife between the different Greeks city-states. So I think, and this is something that you guys can debate or contradict if you want or agree with, but I think if we give the Greeks an earlier victory, we may very well not have seen the rise of the Athenian Republic and the strength of eventual Athenian hegemony that we see in our timeline. I think we see the 13 colonies, quote unquote, being a little bit more disunited, ironically, because when I initially thought about this historical exercise, I'm like, yeah, this would have really galvanized the Greeks. This really would have unified them faster. I don't think so. I think this actually leads to a sharper disagreement over tactics and a sooner splintering of the Greek coalition forces.
I think that's very possible. Let's not forget that in our timeline, one of the reasons why the Peloponnesian War starts in the first place is because Athens, as a result of expulsion of the Persian fleet or expulsion of the Persian forces, by means of destruction of their supply fleet, develops, as I mentioned, or as I can't remember if I mentioned this in the pre-show or if I mentioned this in the show, but I'll repeat it briefly. The Delian League transforms into this expansionist, imperialist, British Royal Navy style force that it then uses to, in many senses, govern. Govern is not necessarily the right word, but exert hegemony, collect resources from Sparta, dominate Sparta, put Sparta in a subservient position. This triggers something that I know we mentioned in the pre-discussion that Chris brought up, something called Thucydides' trap, which is where Sparta sees the ascent of this power in Athens and is growing disturbed by it, rightly or wrongly. They're disturbed by it. They see it as destabilizing, and they viewed the Athenian power as destabilizing. And again, the whole reason why this even exists is because much of Athens is funded by tributes, which they obtain as a result of their dominant naval force, which, if the Persians never invade in the first place, or are repelled or are slowed down in some way, shape, or form, there will be no moment that galvanizes the creation of the Athenian navy from the more defensive Delian League. And I think that as a result, one could argue that you either see a delay in the Peloponnesian War or you see it foment earlier, because Sparta now has tactical. Sparta is essentially in the position that Athens is in our timeline. Athens is the one whose tactics are successful in our timeline at repelling Persian hegemony, repelling the Persians from Greece. They are the ones who now have the quote unquote mandate to say, listen, our tactics succeeded. We were the ones who repelled the Persians by and large. So therefore, we will be the ones to be acting as the sort of quote unquote local hegemon. In the alternate timeline, it is the Spartans who have that mandate. It is the Spartans who can say, listen, our tactics proved superior. We were the ones who were able to repel the Greeks, or at the very least, we were the ones who were able to slow them down such that they never made it to Athens. So therefore, Sparta is in that position. And I think it's fair to say that if Sparta is in that position, they will be much less kind to the Athenians than the Athenians were to the Spartans. And the Athenians weren't even that nice to the Spartans.
Well, I don't even think it's a proven superiority of the Athenians. I think it's that there's an argument to be made for both of them.
Yes.
Because it was a combination of the two that won. So it's not that that the Spartan strategy of a land warfare is necessarily better. It just, they can make that argument.
Yes, but Chris, you're not a good Spartan, right? You're not a good Spartan. A Spartan takes credit for everything, and a Spartan exerts his dominance and does not recognize any ancillary support that he may or may not have. So I think to assume that Sparta would be gracious and share the credit and, be gracious to their allies, quote unquote allies, is a tall ask. But I think the central question, which I would like to hear the opinion of my fellow panelists, is: does this precipitate an earlier Peloponnesian War? Does it precipitate a later Peloponnesian War? Or does it altogether dissolve the idea of a Peloponnesian War and never occurs?
I'll go out on a limb and say earlier. I think this leads to an earlier set of disagreements. This idea of two, uneasy, like, first of all, like Chris mentioned, having Sparta and Athens being seen as the dominant Greek city-states still really hasn't developed at this point. So not only do we have them, we have other minor parties in the mix. So I think, personally, this is probably going to lead to a sooner Peloponnesian War, and a very likely under King Leonidas, who not only lives in this alternate timeline, but he has the superior, land-based tactics. I can easily see him, and not the Persians, leading a sack of Athens.
I think what you see is almost a Greek civil war, a multipolar Greek civil war. I'm kind of thinking about the 30 Years' War in Germany, where you have, not only do you not have very well-defined sides, you have city-states making the decision to switch sides, and a political intrigue brought into it there, where they're just trying to get the best deal for themselves.
Yeah, I could certainly see that.
We should also entertain the notion that, as was mentioned previously, right, even in the Peloponnesian War, after Persia has been thoroughly expelled, they're still financially involved in the Peloponnesian War by means of funding the Spartan forces. To me, it's entirely conceivable that Persia would recognize this. All right, we've been invading Athens right now, invading Greece writ large is just not feasible right now. Let's
reach too far.
We'll retreat. Sparta and Athens, they already hate each other anyways, and all the minor players, there's so much disunity. Wouldn't it be better if we just financed one side, or maybe financed multiple sides, let them go to war with each other, let them kill each other, and then we'll go ahead and feast on the corpses?
I mean,
to me, this is a very viable strategy that actually leads to a successful, unrepelled invasion by Persia. It just happens a little bit later. So all it requires is Xerxes to be just a little patient.
I really love that idea, especially when you pair that with how we got here, which was the Persians basically allowing the Greek city-states of Ionia, of Western Turkey, to still keep their own leaders that just pay fealty to the Persian Empire. And it was a revolt against those leaders that, supported by Athens, blah, 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 led to the punitive expedition. So I think it is very conceivable for the Persians not just to finance, but to be very okay, basically just installing leaders in either the individual city states or a unified polity that pays tribute and fealty to the Persian Empire.
100%. Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
I definitely see that as a very strong possibility.
Basically using the warring city-states, the warring factions to tenderize the meat before they actually go into dine. That, to me, is a very conceivable thing that would be very much in keeping with Persia's military tactics prior.
Yeah. And I mean, really, with how you set that up, I could also see it where it's not even necessarily them having to go in and mop up or do anything militarily, although they might end up doing that. I'm just going to say Sparta is probably one of the last groups of people who would ever want to willingly subject themselves to a higher power or overlord like the Persians. So it might lead to an interesting situation where you end up having the Persians playing these city-states off of each other. Some of them are going to take the Ionian agreement and just be like, okay, we'll keep, running our own show, but we'll just pay you guys a tax. You guys will be formally acknowledged as our rulers, our leaders, but we're still going to have a lot of autonomy here, kind of like the Ionian states. Persia really has their main bone to pick with Athens. And the other Greek city-states are going to be more than happy to assist in, getting back at Athens, or at least being seen as superior to them. And eventually the Persians they're working with the Spartans, but the Spartans are not going to want to take that Ionian arrangement, that Ionian deal. And so we can end up having a situation, and maybe this is, a little bit too speculative or a little bit too far off course into the future, but I could see an outcome where we end up having most of the Greek city-states ultimately align themselves with Persia. Athens gets forcibly taken over and ransacked at a later date, and Sparta too is originally a functional ally of Persia, but then once they are given an offer they can't refuse, they're not going to want to take that, and they'll get taken over as well. What do you guys think about that possibility?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very much conceivable. I think it's maybe a little bit, I don't know. I think it's difficult to treat with Sparta. I think that ultimately the Persians are going to have an eye on doing what they ultimately wanted to do, which is ransack Athens and then take over and expand their empire continually. And ultimately that's going to absorb Sparta. And that might end up being because Sparta just it is in keeping with its history and is constantly aggressing. And, a non-Spartan by any other name is still a non-Spartan, right? Just because Athens is now Persia doesn't mean that Sparta is now happy to treat with them. Sparta is going to want to continue to be a hegemon, just as it did in our timeline. So I would take issue with the idea of them settling a permanent peace with Persia. But certainly,
well, that's exactly what I was saying. I was saying the Spartans are not going to want to have peace with.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood your point. Yeah. Yes, I agree.
What I was saying was that the Spartans would have an uneasy alliance with the Persians to, get rid of Athens, do whatever, short-term goals, but they're not going to want to take an agreement to come under Persian subjugation. That's something they're never going to accept.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood. Yes.
Yeah, I might not have explained it super well, but essentially I see Sparta ultimately being taken over forcibly by the Persians because the Spartans don't agree to an Ionian bargain. They are not going to want to accept that.
Well, I'm kind of picturing kind of a Muscovy situation where they are taken over forcefully, but they never accept it. So they're constantly pushing against that arrangement.
I could really see that. I could very easily see that.
And the other thing is, if you kind of have Athens basically brought to heel. And Sparta being kind of the essence of Greece, what does that do for what we consider Greece? Because our understanding of Greece has these two things in it, as kind of always that the dichotomy of Athens of learning and trade and democracy, and Sparta of a more militaristic. There's always I just connect everything to everything. There's kind of the initial idea in World War II of both sides claim Greece as their origin. Kind of the Western Allies claim Athens as the birthplace of democracy, and the Axis/fascist claim Sparta as like the militaristic successful society that violently holds down the Helots. So I think if we have this scenario where Athens is kind of badly dealt with, Greece doesn't mean what it does to us.
Greece doesn't mean
No.
what it does at all. And I think this presents a very interesting point and fascinating point to consider as well. A lot of this sets the stage for the early Roman Republic and what eventually becomes the Roman Empire in our timeline. That changes drastically with all of what's going on here.
The first place I want to go is Macedonia.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in Philip and Alexander, and
Yeah.
they are able to take advantage of kind of things are paused long enough for them to be able to take advantage of. They're kind of Greeks, it's very, very interesting that the term is Hellenic for like the actual hardcore Greeks, Hellenistic for the Macedonian period.
Yeah.
Because they're able, they're close enough. So what happens with that?
Can I get the show banned in another Eastern European country?
You can try.
The former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, or otherwise now modern known as North Macedonia, has very little to do with the King Philip and Alexander the Great that we know of. So just for any Macedonian listeners who they have to name their country North Macedonia because that pisses off the Greeks, rightly so. Like the country that is now known as Macedonia has very little ties to the Macedonia of antiquity. So there we go. Got ourselves banned in another country.
Yes. But I think, Chris, you bring up an excellent point, which is that so much of what we attribute to being Greek was a consequence of their victory in the Peloponnesian War, was a consequence of them having that hegemonic power to build quintessentially Greek things like the Parthenon, which were the places which was the place where so much of Greek culture came to fruition. I mean, again, like pretty much if you think of something Greek, if you think of a person who's Greek, what are you going to think? You're thinking of Socrates, right?
Right.
Well,
Plato,
Socrates was
all the philosophers.
Socrates, Sophocles, Aristophanes. This is all happening in the Parthenon, which is funded by tributes that they get as a direct result of them being victorious in the Peloponnesian War. If we have a situation where there's a multipolar Greek environment going on, and you have Persia, as I said, tenderizing the meat, fomenting disunity, I don't think there's a lot of room in that environment for a cultural icon like Greece to ascend in the way that it does. And of course, as I can't remember if it was Chris or Evan mentioned, that's going to have profound effects from Alexander to the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire I've always thought of as being this weird sort of hybrid between Sparta and Athens, combining the two in some ways harmonious, in other ways extremely disharmonious ways. but the Roman Empire is without a doubt informed by Greek traditions, and those Greek traditions in this alternate timeline simply don't have the oxygen to develop in the way that they do. And I think it's interesting to explore what those consequences might be in the more immediate aftermath of the not
The other
Peloponnesian
reason
War.
I kind of think about the importance of whatever Macedonians they are is because they do remove the Persians from the stage early.
Exactly. And they end up taking over and supplanting the Persian Empire in our timeline. So, and they're responsible for spreading Hellenistic Greek culture across most of the known world at that point. So, if you have Persian culture mainly kind of starting to become established and a hegemon in a lot of what is now modern Greece, you have the Macedonians, whatever they are ultimately going to end up doing, whether they become, I guess the best way that I can see this happening in a more immediate aftermath is because, King Philip's not going to go away. Alexander the Great's not going to go away. They're still going to be important military powers, but there might be a more muted impact of their role because the Persians are a stronger hegemon and a stronger power.
I mean, are they kind of, to get back to my Russian analogy, which is a pretty deep cut.
Yeah. Leave it to Chris to find a way to loop Russia into this. I'll find another way to loop Russia into this. Russia claims to be is one of the many countries that claims to be the true descendant of the Roman Empire. So
are they the Dmitry Donstoys that are kind of uniting the Greek people against in this case, the Persian occupation?
Mm-hmm. I can see that. I could definitely see that as a possibility.
The other thing being, if they are coming up against if they have to drive the Persians out of Greece, does Alexander have enough time in his life to actually get much beyond Anatolia? If it's easier for Philip to go and pick off smaller states if they're fighting against the collaborationist Greeks and the Persians. Do they kind of almost like reconstruct a Greek polity instead of a multi-ethnic empire and be able to expand further east than Ionia?
I think the focus is going to be on reconstructing, make Greece great again. I honestly think that's what the focus is going to be, which is very interesting because, Chris, I want you to mention this as well. You threw this into the pre-podcast discussion, but around this time is when the Athenians expand out to an interesting part of the Mediterranean. So how about you touch upon that, Chris? Because I want to throw in another player here as well, very briefly.
I'm gonna tell a story because I have made a ton of connections. Father was a New Yorker, which is why Alexander Hamilton was shot in Jersey. Okay, knew a pushcart hot dog stand owner from Sicily that got a job working at the Columbia University Department of Antiquities because, and this was in the 1960s, the language that he grew up speaking in interior Sicily was closer to the Greek of Homer and Thucydides and Herodotus than the language in the streets of Athens. Basically, that the Greeks colonized southern Italy and left that little part of their culture there. And a big part of the blending of, all of us are familiar, I think, with mythology where it's the god of war Ares or Mars. There's this very clear dichotomy.
There's the Greek name and the Roman name.
And
same gods, different names.
And, kind of getting to what you were mentioning earlier, Russia, Muscovy, considering itself the third Rome, there is kind of an intellectual track record of the Greeks to the Romans, to either the Holy Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Russians. There is kind of an intellectual throughway. And if what we have happening is basically the Athenians and the Greeks not being able to settle other parts of the Mediterranean, maybe that germ of that culture, we see a lot of what happens with the split in the later Roman Empire, where the West, what is Western Roman Empire, Italy, Gaul, Spain, don't see themselves connected to anything Greek.
Yeah. I definitely see that as a very strong possibility. And even we could argue the development of a more, shall I say, unique, independent, I guess, sort of culture and understanding, like that's separate from the Greeks and their understanding of the world. That's a very interesting, strong possibility. I was thinking as well, I wish I knew what this was. Even what the premise was, I cannot recall what it was. I think it had something to do with a different ancient Greek battle. It was in the early days of this podcast, but there's just a mini nuke I'm going to drop because I haven't developed this thought at all. But if what we're developing here holds, and we basically have more of a, reconstituted Greece under Philip and Alexander, doesn't really expand eastward too much. I mean, what we're essentially saying is Persia as a polity, as an entity, sticks around for a lot longer than it does in our timeline. That means that the conditions of, let's say, early Christianity, Jesus Christ is probably not dying on a Roman cross. He very well might actually, in fact, be dying on a Persian cross, right? Well, and I know this is not original to me. I believe this is a thought that Don articulated in, one of the earlier shows. But the point I'm getting at is this: there may be another player that was not on the friendliest of terms with the Greeks, and they're a merchant people, not really mainly focused on conquering. They're mainly focused on making money. These are the guys that were the thorns in the side of Rome for a pretty long time. The Carthaginians. I could very easily see the Carthaginians playing, and the Etruscans, which were really the main guys that were working in modern Italy before the Greeks and the Romans ended up becoming a bigger deal. They can probably have more of a say over what happens in Northern Africa, Western Europe, what we would kind of consider the Western Roman Empire. I guess you can kind of define it as 3 spheres of influence that really starts developing, as opposed to really what we would say is 2 in our timeline. We would see, whatever's going on with the Gauls and what become the Franks and the Goths and whatever, Visigoths, Goths in Northern Europe, Western Europe, Carthaginians, Etruscans. We have a reconstituted Greece in the middle. Kind of, and you can almost act maybe as necessarily a buffer state between the Western European side and a Persian Empire that still exists for quite a bit longer.
What I think might be interesting is the Phoenician polity. The Phoenicians initially were kind of out of what is today Lebanon, and their settlers founded Carthage and started that. So I think it might be interesting to think about. Right now, we were talking a little bit about Rome being the inheritor of the 2 states. Maybe Phoenicia being the inheritor of what we consider Athens.
Oh, that's what I was going to go for. I was going to say they don't really give a hoot about the militaristic side of things, but I would say they're more than happy to accept the mercantile, the philosophical, all of those sorts of heritages that would be passed on to them by maybe Athenian refugees or whatever you want to say. Yeah, no, I think that would be really interesting to see develop as a Neo-Phoenician or just Carthaginian, whatever you want to call it, sort of polity and culture. Because they're not very interested in governing, they're interested in making money. And I think the Athenians would find a home there pretty easily.
Yeah, we could also consider the fact that, like, again, perhaps Persia would treat a conquered Greece in the same way that Rome can treat a conquered Greece. Rome conquered Greece, and they really just treated Greeks as sort of like models that they're going to base their society off of. I mean, how many Roman emperors were Greek wannabes, right?
Or more so taught by Greeks, educated by Greeks.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Let's not forget
exactly.
who Alexander's private tutor was.
Exactly, right.
Right?
So,
Socrates.
yes. So it is entirely conceivable that Persia is going to have that same attitude towards the Greeks. And we may just what we attribute to Roman philosophy and Greek philosophy, we would just attribute to Persia and to Persian philosophy.
I'm not sure if I necessarily see that. But Chris,
I
do you
don't
want
agree
to?
with that either. The
Yeah.
reason I say that is, and kind of Evan talking about Christianity made me think about this. The Persians accept other cultures and they allow people to do their own culture. I'm thinking about the Persians coming in and ending the Babylonian expulsion.
Mm-hmm.
And also, by the way, getting into how the Hellenistic Ptolemaic dynasties dealt with Judea and all of that. Very differently. But the Persians allow people to practice their own, but they don't really adapt it into the core. Mm-hmm. And I think the Romans, because they're trying to glom themselves onto what they, in a really weird way, consider Greek culture superior to their own. And we may be breaking that, but I don't kind of, Kai kept me honest about not being a very good Spartan and not being a Spartan chauvinist. The Persians will allow Greece to do its own thing, but they will not accept it. They will not bring it into.
They're not going to incorporate
it. It's okay,
it.
Chris. You can say it. I'm not a good Persian. I'll accept the criticism. Also, on the point of criticism, not really criticism, but correction. Alexander the Great's tutor was Aristotle, not Socrates.
I was going to say
Socrates did not exist. Just kidding. But
yeah, no, thank you for that correction. As soon as I said that, I'm like, wait, no, it wasn't. Yeah, but I'm grateful that you did that. You issued that correction. But anyway, what I was going to contribute to that is on a religious level, the Persians are Zoroastrians. They have their own thing. Fairly uniquely for, because outside of the Jews, the Persians are monotheistic. And so there's another layer to, I would say, their being okay with, chill with subjugated peoples practicing their own culture, but they have just very fundamentally different religious beliefs that would prevent them fully adopting elements of Greek culture and just repurposing it for their own. The Romans are more than happy to just Control C, Control V. They're more than happy to just be like, hey, we're going to take all of what these guys established and set up, and we're just going to continue the arc. We're going to continue the Greco-Roman cinematic universe. Like, they're very predisposed to that. But anyway, I think as we're approaching, I think we're a little bit over an hour here. I think that's most all that I wanted to talk about during this episode. There is one main meme that I want to point out before we bring this episode to a close. And Chris already mentioned it's probably going to be the episode art for this episode, but I just want to know.
No problem.
Yeah. I just want to know for posterity's sake, the Richard Nixon meme, man, I think I'll safely speak for all of us on the panel. We relate to that a little bit too hard. Him just talking about alternate history about the Greeks and the Persians fighting each other on his dates just seems like a very on the nose thing for a Fork in Time panelists to do. So if you're curious about why that's the episode art, well, if it wasn't self-explanatory enough,
It's a meme, maybe just amongst us, but we love it a lot.
oh, we love it, maybe a little too much. But anyway, anything else that you two would like to bring up before we draw things to a close?
No, I think we digested the topic well. I'm satisfied with how we handled it.
Yeah, no, I think we did a really good job. I do think 300 as a film, like, and the cultural zeitgeist moment of that, well, it's I don't know if it's still going to be called 300. It'll probably just be called the Spartans or something like that, because really the whole point about the 300 number are the 300 Spartans that decided to stay and fight to the death and everything. I still think that sort of idea, and especially if history pans out the way that we talk about in the alternate timeline of, just this whole idea of the Spartan legacy being absorbed and adopted by other cultures and whatever, it's probably still going to be a thing. But given King Leonidas is still around, he doesn't perish, the Spartans don't all die in that battle, whatever. Unfortunately, we are probably not going to have the legendary moment of "This is Sparta," at least in the same context. We'll probably still have movies, which will probably be more like historical documentaries or edgies, edutainment, educational movies. We'll probably have a historical epic documented by Christopher Nolan.
We talked about. I think this might be more like spy drama of flipping cities and the politics of it. Just the hardcore, forget everyone else action movie genre.
Ooh. Yeah, I could see that. I could totally see that. But anyway, those were my passing thoughts. I think we've just about squeezed all the olive oil we could out of this. We've pounded the wine press enough on this just to throw some Mediterranean references in there. Thank you all so much for listening to this. Thank you so much for tuning in to whatever portion of the last 300 episodes you've tuned in on. I just wanted to say we are profoundly grateful for each and every one of you for tuning in. If you participate on the Discord, you listen, you donate on Patreon, however you support the show, we are immensely grateful for your support. Without you guys, we certainly would not have been around for 300 episodes. All of the changes and personnel, and I call them personnel, but really we're just a bunch of history geeks, amateur historians who just love talking about and bandying about alternate history forks in time. Without you guys, we would not be able to be here. And here's to, hopefully, I'm not going to say 300 more. That seems a little audacious, but I'm just going to say however many more episodes we decide to do and to keep this thing going. I, again, cannot emphasize and stress enough. Thank you. So, with that all being wrapped up, we like to end these episodes mostly in a similar fashion with a little twist from whoever wants to give a twist on it. If we stumble across a fork in time, what do you think we should do with it?
Pull a Richard Nixon and ruin a good date by discussing the consequences of the Peloponnesian War.
I love it. Whew, you were on the money with that one. You were ready to go. Chris, did you have a suggestion? Or are you going to go with that?
I was actually going to say no. Just like block the road and not let anyone through it. Just getting back to the more hardcore, like Thermopylae reference of it.
There you go. Or maybe have Richard Nixon instead be like, "I'm not a crook. I'm not a Spartan." I don't know.
Yes.
But anyway, the way we normally end the episode is if we stumble across a fork in time, we think you should take it. Have a good one, everyone. Take care.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.